In this alternate history, 9 pardons become the legal lever that breaks federal air pollution law, and tens of thousands of Americans pay the price with their lungs.
This story is fictional. It's based on real events, but everything beyond the known facts is speculation. Our goal is to explore an alternate timeline, not to rewrite history, but to imagine what might have been.
On July 4, 2026, President Trump signed pardons for 11 people, 9 of them convicted of violating the Clean Air Act. The White House framed it as correcting an overreach. Prosecutions it called politically motivated, environmental regulations used as weapons against working Americans and small businesses. Environmental groups and public health advocates protested, but on a holiday weekend, the news cycle moved fast. By Monday, most of Washington had turned its attention elsewhere. What the pardons did, quietly, was hand industry lawyers something they had been searching for. A political signal strong enough to turn into a legal argument. But what if that argument worked? Within 3 weeks, attorneys representing 14 major industrial companies filed emergency motions in federal courts across the country. Their argument was straightforward. If the executive branch had declared these Clean Air Act prosecutions selective, politically motivated, and unjust, then every pending prosecution carried the same taint. The pardons, they argued, constituted an implicit admission that enforcement had been arbitrary. A federal district court in Texas agreed and issued a preliminary injunction halting EPA enforcement in the Fifth Circuit. Within days, 2 more circuits followed. By the end of July, federal Clean Air Act prosecutorial activity was effectively frozen nationwide. The EPA's enforcement division had no playbook for this. Career attorneys described it internally as a controlled demolition. The injunctions didn't destroy the law, they just made it impossible to use. Compliance costs money. When the credible threat of prosecution disappears, the calculus changes overnight. Refineries in the Gulf Coast that had been negotiating consent decrees quietly walked away from the table. Coal-fired power plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania started running at higher output. A chemical manufacturing cluster outside Houston reported a 30% increase in production within 60 days, output that had previously been capped by emissions agreements now sitting in legal limbo. State environmental agencies tried to fill the gap. California activated its own enforcement apparatus. New York and Illinois followed. But most states lacked the resources, the laboratory infrastructure, and the legal staff to replicate federal enforcement at scale. In states where the political will existed, companies threatened to relocate to states where it didn't. A threat credible enough to slow even the most aggressive state attorneys general. The air got worse. Not in a single visible event that could anchor a news story. It got worse incrementally, statistically, in the bodies of people who were already vulnerable. Hospital admissions for respiratory illness rose sharply in industrial corridors through August and September. In Pittsburgh, emergency room intake for acute asthma events increased by 41% compared to the same period the prior year. In Baton Rouge, pediatric respiratory cases overwhelmed a hospital system still recovering from hurricane-related infrastructure damage. Children under 5 and adults over 65 were dying at elevated rates. Death certificates said pneumonia, said heart failure, said complications from pre-existing conditions. The underlying cause didn't appear in those reports. Internationally, the damage compounded. The European Union had been watching the regulatory collapse with alarm. Trade agreements between the US and the EU contained environmental compliance provisions, soft language long assumed to be unenforceable. In October, the EU invoked those provisions and announced a preliminary review of American industrial imports, flagging potential tariffs on goods produced in non-compliant facilities. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce called it economic warfare. The EU called it the agreed terms of the deal. American manufacturers who had celebrated the injunctions now faced the possibility of being locked out of European markets. The financial sector revised its industrial outlook downward. Several major corporations that had quietly expanded output in the summer began issuing earnings warnings in the fall, the short-term gains from reduced compliance costs swallowed by the longer-term price of market access. By the following spring, no single moment had announced what the picture had become. The Clean Air Act remained on the books. The EPA still had offices, still issued reports, still held press briefings, but its enforcement arm was paralyzed by ongoing litigation. Its budget had been cut in a continuing resolution fight. Senior career staff had been leaving for months, some to state agencies, some to the private sector, some simply out of exhaustion. The courts were slowly working through the injunctions. Slowly meant years. In the meantime, an estimated 47 million Americans lived within 10 miles of a major industrial facility operating with no meaningful federal emissions oversight. The death toll was difficult to attribute with precision. Diffuse, distributed across thousands of hospitals and millions of death certificates, invisible as a single event and devastating as a trend. Epidemiologists estimated tens of thousands of excess deaths annually, a number that would compound with every year the system remained broken. The law hadn't been repealed. The courts hadn't ruled it unconstitutional. It had been made unworkable, one pardon at a time, until the air above American cities became something no one was responsible for anymore.
In this world, history went one way. But here, we ask what could have happened. If you want more alternate timelines and government what-ifs, subscribe, comment your theory, and stay tuned. This is State of What If.